Hello, today we're going to be reading two chapters, Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. Let's get started. Chapter 7, Christmas, 1940. The heavy bombing of London, which had happened every night for a long time and was called the Blitz, had slowed down by the end of November 1940, which was probably why my parents thought it was safe for me to return home for Christmas, but they were very wrong. As soon as Christmas was over, the Germans bombed London, but this time it was even worse than before. The whole of the East End of London and the docks were all but destroyed. As soon as the air raid sirens sounded, the Blitz began, and the bombing continued all through the night. The upstairs flat, which my parents rented out, was empty because living on an upper floor meant you had to move to an outside air raid shelter for safety at night, and nobody really wanted to do that. These shelters were called Anderson shelters and were pieces of corrugated iron bent over a hole dug into the ground. Inside you sat on a bench on either side of the shelter. It was damp and dark inside and very frightening, and you listened to the aircraft overhead, to the bombs exploding around you. All you could do was hope that none would fall on your home, and if they did and your home was destroyed, then someone would come to find you, still safe in the shelter. At our last house in Kensal Rise, there had been an Anderson shelter in the garden, but we had just moved to live in the flats over our father's business, and there was nowhere for us to shelter on the night of the Blitz, apart from a small cupboard under the stairs. It was used to store brushes and brooms, dusters and polish and boxes, which we sat on when the air raid started. It was stuffy, but there was a small light bulb so we could see our surroundings, but the ceiling was very low. Somehow, because it had a little door, we felt safer there than under the table. Fortunately, we only had to use it twice. It was a terrible, terrifying night. We had no sleep for the noise of the bombs dropping. My mother was left alone with us because, as my father was an air raid warden, he had to join the other wardens in the area, taking his stirrup pump and bucket of sand to put out incendiary bombs. An incendiary bomb causes fires and was smaller than the large bombs, which were dropped to destroy buildings. As we lived in northwest London, we were more fortunate than the people who lived in the east end of the city, which had been targeted all night by the bombers. We heard the noise of the planes returning to Germany in the early hours in the morning when my father came home. He called us upstairs to the empty flat to look out of the window where we could see a huge orange glow in the far distance, like an enormous bonfire or a firework display. As the smoke cleared, we could see the silhouette of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, which was still standing amongst the remains of other buildings. I found the sight of the top of St. Paul's Cathedral surrounded by smoke and flames almost awe-inspiring. Until that moment, I had been unaware of ever seeing it from our top flat, as in the daytime it was too far away to be visible, but on this terrible night the whole world seemed to have caught it alight, and it stood out intermittently between the clouds of billowing smoke. I wondered what was going to happen to us. Perhaps we would all be killed when the planes came back. After the peace and tranquility of living in Ross for a while, the world seemed to have come to an end, and I did feel frightened for our future. Even though I knew I would soon be returning to the safety of Ross-on-Wye, it was much too dangerous to be staying in London. A few days later, my parents told me that I would be returning to live with the Warren family, who had taken me as their evacuee next year. But this time, my sister Hazel would be coming with me, so she would become an evacuee too. January 1941. Early in the new year, on a bitterly cold January morning, my mother took us to Paddington Station and put us on the train to Gloucester. There we were to be met by someone from the railway station staff and put on the branch line to Ross-on-Wye, where Mrs. Warren would be meeting us. Apart from that, we were all on our own. This time we had a large expanding case with all our belongings packed inside, as well as a hockey stick which had been my present that Christmas. My sister also carried her doll, so we were laden with luggage. At Didcot Station, the train broke down and we had to change trains, crossing over the railway line to another platform. The case was too heavy and cumbersome for us as we struggled to get it up the steps. By this time, I was beginning to feel worried. What would happen to us if we missed this train, or perhaps we got onto the wrong train? We didn't know anybody who we could ask to help us, and everybody else was rushing past us with their luggage, so they didn't miss the train. They probably thought 2 young children belonged to some of the other passengers, as we were very young to be travelling such a long way on our own. Fortunately, the other passengers took pity on us and helped us to get the case on the next train, lifting it up onto the rack overhead, which we could never have done by ourselves. Travelling alone was a little bit frightening for both of us, although I tried to behave like the big sister who was in charge of the situation. If only my teachers had been there with us telling us what to do. But we were all on our own now. Eventually we arrived at Gloucester Station, where we were put on another train for Ross-on-Wye. During this last train journey, Hazel often asked me, "Are we nearly there yet?" Of course, I had no idea if we were nearly there, as it had seemed such a long way to me as well. "We'll soon be there," I kept assuring her, "and then you will meet Mr. and Mrs. Warren and Dorothy and Margaret and the two dogs, Sue and Jill." My sister had never lived in a house with dogs before, and she was very apprehensive. "Are they nice, the dogs? She asked. "They bark quite a lot," I told her, "but only at people they don't know, and they will soon get to know you. They live in the kitchen with Mrs. Warren, mostly, and she is always there, so you won't have to worry about anything." Chapter 8. Back in beautiful Ross-on-Wye. After our long train journey, we eventually arrived at Ross-on-Wye and soon settled down living with the Warren family. Hazel shared Dorothy's bed as there was nowhere else for her to sleep, except for the nights when Mr. Warren was on duty at the telephone exchange, when she shared Mrs. Warren's big bed. It seemed quite natural to have my sister living with me at Ross. Mrs. Warren never made too much fuss of either of us on purpose, as she felt she could not take the place of our real mother. Even so, living with the Warrens was a very happy time for me, because we were safe there from all the bombing in London, and the Warrens were a happy, contented family themselves. As Hazel was too young to attend my school, she was sent to the village primary school at Brampton Abbots. She had been used to a large primary school in London and now found herself in one long room with children of all ages from 5 to 15. To reach Brampton Abbots village, you walk through the dingle, a shortcut. We loved this walk with its high bramble hedges and wild flowers, primroses in the spring and blackberries in the autumn, which we picked to be made into jam or put into blackberry and apple pies by Mrs. Warren or Margaret, who helped with the cooking. Sunday was the day for cooking in the kitchen. We were sometimes sent to church at Brampton Abbot, probably to get us out of the way for a while. At the end of the dingle was a gate, which led into a cornfield with a path to the church and the school. Skylarks flew up from their nests in this corn as we walked along the path, singing above us so high we could never see them. My sister would hurry along this path on school days to catch up with the other children, so she had company when going through the churchyard to the school playground. She found going through the churchyard on her own a bit scary. The children at Brampton Abbots were Church of England. The church at Brampton Abbots was Church of England. We had been brought up as Methodists and were used to the Methodist service, especially when staying with our grandmother, who was a devoted member of the church. Luckily, a husband and wife who sat behind us in church used to bend over to help us to find the place in the prayer book, and we were glad to see that many of the hymns were the same, so we knew how to sing them. We were often sent out on little errands to help Mr. and Mrs. Warren. We would go into the fields to collect sheep's wool caught on the barbed wire around the fences and put it into bags. Wool was valuable and was rationed on clothing coupons. Dorothy used to undo her jumpers and knit them up into different patterns to add some variety. It was called Make Do and Mend, and people made clothes out of all kinds of things, even old curtains. Everything was mended and clothes were passed down the family. Nothing was ever wasted. Sometimes, if parachutes were found to be faulty or packed incorrectly, then the public was allowed to use the silk material for clothes, because it made lovely blouses and underwear. I bought some balls of camel's wool with my pocket money, as it was not on ration. Dorothy taught me how to knit myself a pair of gloves, which were soft and warm, but a bit itchy. We picked wild strawberries in the fields, which were very small and sweet, and even went pea picking in a local farmer's field, pulling the pea pods off the vines and collecting them in buckets with other people. We were paid a little for the peas after they had been weighed, and we were allowed to take some home with us in our buckets for Mrs. Warren to use. To help out with the food, we would go to see Miss Addis, a lady who lived close by, who had a long garden where she grew bushes of red currants. Hazel and I picked the sprays of currants for Mrs. Warren to use in her cooking. Mrs. Addis would make a batter for Welsh cakes, which she cooked on her range for us, dropping spoonfuls of the mixture onto the red-hot top of the range to cook in a few seconds. They were so delicious that we never minded going to pick the tiny fiddly red currants. Margaret told me that Mrs. Addis had green fingers so everything she planted in a garden would grow. I had never heard that expression before, so I used to look closely at Mrs. Addis's fingers every time we saw her, but they never looked green to me. It took me ages before I found out it was just a saying. Thanks for tuning in today, and you can join me tomorrow for chapter 9.